October 11th, 1949, 11:47 p.m., Lenox Avenue, Harlem. The rain didn't so much fall as it seeped out of the low, bruised sky, slicking the asphalt until the streetlights of Harlem bled into long, shimmering ribbons of gold and red. Inside the burgundy Cadillac Fleetwood, the air was thick with cigar smoke and the scent of expensive leather. Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson stared out the passenger side window, his face a mask of placid authority that betrayed none of the cold calculus churning within. At 43, he was the undisputed king of this domain, a man whose name was a key that could open any door or a hammer that could shatter any bone. Yet, power was a strange and heavy coat. It kept you warm, but you could never truly take it off. His driver and confidant, Finley "Fin" Hughes, kept his eyes on the road, his hands light on the wheel. He'd been with Bumpy for a decade, a silent witness to the brutal architecture of empire building. "He's still on us, boss," Fin said, his voice a low rumble that barely disturbed the quiet hum of the engine. He glanced in the rearview mirror. A plain, mud-brown Ford sedan kept a steady 2 car lengths behind, its headlights cutting cones through the mist. "Been there since we left the club." Bumpy didn't turn. He just nodded, a slow, deliberate motion. "Detective Joe Corrigan, 27th Precinct. New to the neighborhood. Irish, from the Bronx. Thinks he's going to make his name putting my head on a platter." The file on Corrigan was thin, but telling. An ex-Marine, decorated at Okinawa. Joined the force and climbed fast. Refused to transfer to a cushy downtown post. Requested Harlem. That, more than anything, had put a knot of unease in Bumpy's gut. Men who requested Harlem were either looking for a payday or a crusade, and he wasn't sure which was more dangerous. For 3 weeks, Corrigan had been a shadow, parked outside Bumpy's office on 124th Street, trailing his car, watching his numbers runners with an unnerving stillness. He never took a dime, never made a threat. He just watched. "What's the play?" Fin asked. Bumpy took a long, slow draw from his cigar, the cherry glowing like a distant, angry star. "The play is we find out what kind of man he is. We find out what he wants. A man who wants nothing is the most expensive man in the world to deal with." He paused, the smoke curling from his lips. "Take a left on 141st. Let's give him a tour of our Harlem." Fin turned, and the Ford followed without hesitation. They wound through the back streets, past the tenements teeming with life, the jazz clubs spilling music and laughter into the wet night, the storefront churches promising salvation. It was a message, a silent display of territory. "This is my kingdom. You are a tourist here." But the Ford stayed latched on, a bloodhound on a scent. "He's patient," Fin noted, a hint of grudging respect in his tone. "Patience is a weapon," Bumpy replied, his eyes finally flicking to the mirror. He saw the silhouette of the man behind the wheel. A ghost. "Tonight, we take that weapon away from him. Pull over by the old bottling plant on the river." A cold dread, familiar and sharp, pricked at Fin's skin. The bottling plant was a place where problems were solved permanently. It was a place of endings. October 12th, 1949, 12:38 a.m., West Harlem Piers. The Cadillac rolled to a silent stop beside the derelict warehouse, its brick facade crumbling like old gingerbread. The river lapped against the decaying piers, a sound like a slow, tired tongue. Fin cut the engine. The only light came from a single, flickering bulb high on a pole, casting long, dancing shadows. Behind them, the Ford pulled up and its headlights died. For a full minute, nothing happened. The silence was absolute, broken only by the river and the distant moan of a ship's horn. Then, the driver's side door of the Ford opened. Detective Joe Corrigan stepped out. He wasn't a big man, but he stood with a Marine's rigid posture, his hands empty and visible at his sides. He wore a rumpled trench coat over a cheap suit, the rain darkening the shoulders. "He's alone," Fin breathed, surprised. "He's either brave or a fool," Bumpy said softly. "Let's find out which." Bumpy's door was opened from the outside by Geechee, one of his lieutenants, who had materialized from the shadows along with 3 other men. They were hard men, their faces grim, their hands hidden inside their coats. They moved with a fluid, predatory grace. Bumpy stepped out, the damp air cold on his face. He stood and watched as Corrigan began to walk toward them, his steps measured, deliberate. "That's far enough," Detective, Bumpy called out, his voice carrying easily in the quiet. Corrigan stopped about 20 feet away, his face partially obscured by shadow. Johnson, I figured it was about time we had a conversation. We have nothing to talk about, Bumpy said. You've been following me for 3 weeks. You're making my associates nervous. It's bad for business. Your business is my business, Corrigan said, his voice flat, devoid of the usual police arrogance. The heroin, Johnson. The junk that's starting to poison these streets. That's my business. Bumpy felt a flash of irritation. I don't deal in poison. I run numbers. I own clubs. I keep order. You want the men flooding this neighborhood with that filth? You go talk to the Italians downtown. They're the ones bringing it in off the boats. And who do you think they sell it through up here? Corrigan shot back. They can't move in Harlem without your permission. You tax them. You get a piece of every bag that puts a needle in some kid's arm. The accusation hung in the air, sharp and ugly because it was true. It was a part of the business he hated, a compromise he'd made for a larger piece with the other families, but it was a stain nonetheless. My rules keep this neighborhood from becoming a war zone, Bumpy said, his voice dropping, taking on a dangerous edge. I provide a service the law won't. I settle disputes. I help people who can't go to the police. I am a necessary evil. You are just a man with a badge who doesn't understand the ecosystem. I understand a dead 14-year-old girl I pulled out of an alley on 135th Street yesterday, Corrigan said, and for the first time, a tremor of raw emotion entered his voice. I understand she had a needle still hanging out of her arm. Her mother said she was a good girl. That's an ecosystem I plan to destroy. Bumpy's men shifted, their hands tightening on the weapons in their pockets. Geechee took a half-step forward. Bumpy raised a single, placating hand. He studied Corrigan. The man's anger was real. It wasn't for show. This wasn't about a shakedown. This was a crusade. And crusaders were the most dangerous men of all because they didn't care if they died. You're a long way from the Bronx, Detective, Bumpy said. You can't change the world. You'll just get yourself killed trying. Maybe, Corrigan said, taking another step forward into the light. His face was pale, his eyes a startlingly clear blue. But I'm not the one who's going to die tonight. It happened fast. Corrigan's hand blurred toward his coat. Bumpy's men moved as one, weapons appearing in their hands. But it wasn't a gun Corrigan pulled. It was a folded piece of paper. A newspaper clipping. He threw it on the wet ground between them. Read it, Corrigan said. Bumpy gestured to Finn. Finn walked forward cautiously, picked up the sodden paper, and brought it back. He angled it toward the light of the Cadillac's interior. It was a small article from the New York Daily News, a few days old. A filler piece on page 12. Veteran officer cleared in corruption probe. Detective Frank Costello of the 27th Precinct has been exonerated of all charges. Bumpy's blood ran cold. Frank Costello, a notoriously dirty cop, a man on the payroll of the Genovese family. 2 weeks ago, Bumpy had received a tip from a source inside the department. A new detective, working with Costello, was building a massive RICO case against Bumpy's entire operation. The source had identified the new man as Joe Corrigan. It was a false alarm, a piece of deliberate misinformation designed to make him do exactly this. He had been set up. He's with Costello, Geechee hissed, his voice full of venom. The Italians sent him to set you up, Bumpy. We gotta finish this. Now, Bumpy looked from the paper to Corrigan's face. Corrigan was watching him, his expression unreadable. He had walked into a trap. Not Bumpy's trap. A much larger one. If Bumpy killed a cop, any cop, even a dirty one, the full, righteous fury of the NYPD would descend on Harlem. There would be raids, beatings, mass arrests. The fragile peace he maintained would be shattered. The Italians would use the chaos to flood the streets with their poison, unhindered. If he let Corrigan go, he'd look weak, and the detective might still be part of a plot. This was the crisis. Not of blood, but of choice. A choice between his own code of survival and the well-being of the 10,000 souls in his kingdom. For the first time in a long time, Bumpy Johnson felt the icy grip of powerlessness. He was a king checkmated by a pawn. He looked at his men. He looked at the river. He looked at the crusader cop who had just unknowingly handed him the key to his own destruction. Take him, Bumpy said, his voice flat and dead. Bring him inside. October 12, 1949. 1:15 a.m. Inside the bottling plant. The air in the warehouse was thick with the smell of rust, damp concrete, and rat droppings. A single bare bulb hung from a cord, throwing stark shadows that made the cavernous space feel like the belly of some great metal beast. Corrigan was tied to a wooden chair, a trickle of blood running from his split lip where Geechie's pistol had connected with his mouth. He hadn't fought back. He had just stared at Bumpy with those unervingly calm blue eyes. Bumpy circled him slowly, like a shark. His men stood by the walls, silent and waiting for the order. "You're a smart man, Johnson," Corrigan said, his voice raspy. "You have to know this is a bad idea." "The bad idea was you getting in your car tonight," Bumpy countered. He stopped in front of him. "Tell me about Costello." "What's to tell? He's a crook with a badge. He takes Italian money and looks the other way. I put in a report on him my first week here. My captain buried it. My source says you're his new partner. Says you two are building a case to take me down." A flicker of something, surprise, then understanding, crossed Corrigan's face. He let out a short, harsh laugh that turned into a cough. "Costello? He hates my guts. He's the one who started the rumor I was an internal affairs plant. He'd love to see me in a ditch. And he'd love it even more if you were the one who put me there. You kill me, the department has to respond. They'll tear this place apart. While they're busy cracking skulls up here, Costello and his friends downtown will have a free hand." He leaned forward, as much as the ropes would allow. "You're being played, Johnson, by the same people I am." Bumpy stared at him, searching for the lie. He saw none. He saw a man who believed every word he was saying. A man who had walked into the lion's den to talk about a dead girl in an alley. Finn stepped closer to Bumpy. "Boss, what if he's telling the truth?" he whispered. "This whole thing stinks." "Shut up, Finn," Geechie snapped from across the room. "He's a cop. He's lying. We do what we gotta do." Bumpy held up a hand for silence. He walked over to a grimy window and looked out at the river. The city lights glittered on the far shore, a world away. He thought of that 14-year-old girl. He had a daughter, Elise. He thought of the thousands of daughters in Harlem. He had built his empire on a foundation of control, on the promise that while he was a criminal, he was their criminal. He kept the wolves from the door. But now, the wolves were using him to open the door themselves. The weight of it all pressed down on him. The power, the responsibility, the constant, grinding vigilance. He felt a deep, profound weariness settle into his bones. He was a king on a crumbling throne. For a brief, terrifying moment, he felt a tremor in his hands, a physical manifestation of the impossible choice before him. He clenched his fists, forcing it down. No one could see the crack in the armor. Not ever. Witness testimony. Finn Hughes. Excerpt from a private conversation, 1972. "I'll never forget that night. Never. I'd seen Bumpy order men killed before. I'd seen him stone cold, no emotion, just a nod of the head and a man's life was over. But that night was different. When he was standing by that window, looking out at the water, I saw something I'd never seen before. He looked old and tired. He looked like a man carrying the whole damn world on his shoulders. Geechie and the boys, they were ready. They wanted blood. A cop is a cop. That was their thinking. And maybe they were right, most of the time. But Bumpy, he was playing a different game. Chess, not checkers. He saw the whole board. He saw what killing that detective would do to Harlem. He knew it would unleash hell. He turned from the window, and his face was just blank. Empty. I thought, this is it. He's going to give the word. He walked back over to the cop, Corrigan, and he just looked down at him for the longest time. The silence in that place was so loud you could feel it in your teeth. Then he said, "Cut him loose." Geechie just about had a fit. "Boss, are you crazy? We can't let him walk." And Bumpy turned to Geechie, and he gave him a look that could freeze fire. And he said, real quiet, "I gave an order, that was the end of that. We cut him loose." October 12th, 1949, 2:05 a.m. Inside the bottling plant. Corrigan rubbed his wrists. The rope burns raw and red. He stood up slowly, never taking his eyes off Bumpy. He was a man who had been pulled back from the edge of his own grave, and the knowledge of it sat strangely on him. "You're making a mistake," Geechie snarled, his hand still on his gun. "The mistake was listening to bad information," Bumpy said, his voice now steady, the moment of vulnerability gone. He was the king again. "The mistake was almost letting another man's war become my own." He stepped up to Corrigan, until they were barely a foot apart. You and I are not friends. We will never be friends. But we have a common enemy. The men who want to poison my neighborhood for profit are the same men who are using you and me as pawns against each other. So what now? Corrigan asked, his voice low. Now, you walk out of here, Bumpy said. You go back to your precinct. You tell them you got jumped by some junkies and they stole your wallet. You forget this night ever happened. You forget my name. I can't do that, Corrigan said, shaking his head. I can't forget that girl in the alley. Then do your job, Bumpy said, his voice dropping to an intense whisper. But do it smart. You want the heroin dealers? Go after the street-level scum. The ones who don't work for me. The freelancers. The ones who serve the downtown outfits directly. Hurt them. Hurt their bottom line. Make it so expensive for them to do business in Harlem that they pack up and leave. You do that, and you'll find that your witnesses show up to court. You'll find that evidence doesn't get lost. You'll find that your car starts every morning. It was an offer, a treaty, a delineation of a new border. You fight your war. I will fight mine. And where our interests align, we will not be enemies. Corrigan stared at him, the full implication of the offer sinking in. This was a deal with the devil, a pact that would forever blur the line he had sworn to uphold. But it was also the only way he might actually be able to do some good. The only way to fight the system was to work outside of it. He was being offered a shield. And what about you? Corrigan asked. Your numbers? Your other rackets? My business is with the people of Harlem, Bumpy said. It doesn't involve dead children in alleys. You focus on the poison. I'll handle the rest. Corrigan held Bumpy's gaze for a long moment. Then, he gave a single, sharp nod. He turned and walked toward the door, his back straight, his steps even. He didn't look back. He opened the door, stepped out into the rain, and was gone. Geechee was seething. Boss, you just let a snake go. He'll be back with 100 cops. No, he won't, Bumpy said, turning to face his furious lieutenant. He's not a snake. He's a soldier. And he just realized he's been fighting on the wrong side of the war. He looked at his men, his expression hard as granite. This conversation is over. It never happened. We were never here. Understand? They all nodded, their own fears and doubts silenced by the absolute certainty in his voice. But as Finn drove him home through the pre-dawn gloom, Bumpy stared out the window, the weight of his decision settling in. He had spared a man's life. He had made a pact with a cop. He had gambled his entire empire and the safety of his neighborhood on the integrity of one man. He had no idea if he had just saved Harlem or signed its death warrant. October 15th, 1949, 3:20 p.m., 27th Precinct. For 3 days, a tense quiet fell over Harlem. Bumpy's organization held its breath, waiting for the kick-in squads, the mass arrests, the retribution that never came. Bumpy himself was a coiled spring, sleeping little, his mind replaying the scene at the warehouse over and over. He had shown mercy, a commodity he could rarely afford. The withdrawal from the certainty of violence left him agitated and raw. Inside the precinct, Detective Joe Corrigan sat at his desk, typing up a report on a liquor store robbery. His face was a roadmap of fading bruises, his lips stitched. He'd told his captain he'd run into a door. No one believed him, but no one pressed it. He was alive, and that was enough. Frank Costello swaggered over, a cheap cigarillo clamped in his teeth. Heard you had a rough night, Corrigan. Walk into another door, he sneered. Corrigan didn't look up from his typewriter. Something like that. You keep sniffing around where you don't belong. The next door you walk into is going to be a coffin lid, Costello said, leaning in close. The boss is downtown. They don't like guys who ask too many questions about their business partners. Corrigan stopped typing. He looked up, his blue eyes flat and cold. Is that a threat, Frank? It's a friendly piece of advice, Costello said with a greasy smile. Stick to chasing purse snatchers. Leave the real police work to the men who understand how this city works. Corrigan went back to his typing. Thanks for the advice, Frank. I'll be sure to file it away. Costello watched him for a moment, then shrugged and walked away. He'd delivered his message. He didn't notice that the report Corrigan was typing wasn't about a robbery. It was a detailed surveillance log of a known Genovese heroin drop spot on 112th Street. Corrigan was done filing reports with his captain. He was done playing by the rules of a rigged game. He had a new set of rules now. He was a man recovering, not just from a beating, but from a shattered worldview. Bumpy Johnson, the devil of Harlem, had shown him a truth he couldn't ignore. The only way to clean the house was to get your hands dirty. 2 nights later, a major heroin deal went bad. 2 of the Genovese family's top uptown distributors were arrested by a uniformed patrol that just happened to be in the right place at the right time. The tip was anonymous. The half-kilo of pure heroin they confiscated was not. Frank Costello was furious. The Genovese family was out a lot of money. And in his car, parked on a quiet street in Sugar Hill, Bumpy Johnson read the story in the morning paper and allowed himself a small, grim smile. The gamble was beginning to pay off. The shield was being forged. April 28, 1952. Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary. The fog rolled in thick off the San Francisco Bay, shrouding the island prison in a damp, gray blanket. It muffled all sound, creating a world of stone, steel, and silence. Bumpy Johnson, now prisoner number 1117, stood in the exercise yard, staring out at the water he couldn't see. He'd been here for 6 months, serving a 15-year sentence for conspiracy to sell narcotics. It was a lie, a frame-up orchestrated by the very federal agents who couldn't touch the Italians. But it was his reality now. His kingdom was a 6-by-9-foot cell. His only link to the world, to Harlem, was his wife, Mamie. Her letters were his lifeline. And tucked within them were always coded messages, news from Finn, who was running the day-to-day operations. He unfolded the most recent letter, the paper worn soft from a dozen readings. Mamie wrote about their daughter, about family matters, but he skipped to the part he was looking for, the paragraph about their old building superintendent. Finn says the super on 141st Street is still doing a fine job. He had to fix a major plumbing leak last week. A real mess. Some of the new tenants from downtown were trying to flood the whole building, but he shut off their water at the source. He's very particular about keeping the building clean. Bumpy closed his eyes, translating the code. The super was Corrigan. The plumbing leak was a new wave of heroin. The new tenants from downtown were the Bonanno family, trying to move in on the territory the Genovese had lost. And Corrigan, true to his unspoken word, had shut off their water. He was still protecting the neighborhood, still holding the line. For the next decade, this was how he experienced the pact he had made. It came in fragments, in whispers passed through prison glass, in carefully worded letters. July 1955. A letter mentioned that this super had helped the fire department put out a small fire before it could spread. Finn later confirmed through a lawyer that Corrigan had personally intervened to stop a crew of corrupt cops from the 32nd Precinct from shaking down and firebombing a Harlem barbershop that refused to pay protection. He'd threatened to go to the papers with evidence of their racket. They backed off. September 1958, the kids on the block started a baseball team. The super donated some new bats and gloves. He makes sure they have a safe place to play after school. This meant Corrigan had cleared out a dope house that had opened up across from a public school, arresting the dealers and leaning on the landlord to evict them for good. He was not just a cop. He was becoming a guardian. March 1961. This message was more direct, delivered by Bumpy's lawyer. Finn says to tell you that your friend with the badge testified. In open court, against 2 of his own, Corrigan had broken the blue wall of silence. He had taken the stand and buried 2 dirty detectives who were running their own drug ring. It nearly cost him his career and his life. He was branded a rat, a pariah within his own department. But he'd done it anyway. He'd upheld his end of the bargain, even when Bumpy was 1,000 miles away, locked in a cage. Each story was a brick in the wall Corrigan was building around Harlem. A wall Bumpy could no longer maintain himself. Lying on his cot in the cold silence of Alcatraz, Bumpy felt a strange and complicated emotion. It wasn't friendship. It wasn't gratitude. It was a deep, abiding respect for the enemy who had become an unwilling ally. The crusader who had kept his word. He had spared one man's life, and in return, that man was shielding the lives of thousands. It was the best deal Bumpy Johnson had ever made. Witness testimony. Finn Hughes. Excerpt from a private conversation, 1972. Those years Bumpy was away, they were hard. Every shark in the city smelled blood in the water. They all thought Harlem was ripe for the picking. But this cop, Corrigan, he was something else. He was like a ghost. He knew our operation, knew our number spots, our social clubs. He could have shut us down 100 times. But he never touched us. Instead, He went after the junk. Only the junk. And he was relentless. He'd bust a dealer here, turn over a shipment there. He made life hell for the wise guys trying to bring that poison uptown. He couldn't stop it all. Nobody could. But he contained it. He became this boogeyman to the dope slingers. The other cops hated him. They called him Bumpy's boy. They thought he was on the take. But he wasn't. I know. We tried to send him money once. A Christmas gift, you know? Just a gesture. An envelope with $5,000 in it. We had a guy leave it in his car. The next day, the $5,000 was donated, in cash, to the Harlem Boys Club. Anonymously. That's the kind of man he was. He wasn't our boy. He was his own man. He just happened to believe in the same thing Bumpy did. That Harlem was worth protecting. February 21st, 1963. 10:12 a.m. New York City. The ferry cut through the choppy waters of the harbor, the skyline of Manhattan growing larger with every minute. Bumpy Johnson stood on the deck, a free man. He was 57 years old. The 10 years in Alcatraz had etched new lines on his face, put a touch of silver at his temples. He wore a tailored suit that Mamie had brought him, but he still felt the phantom weight of prison grays. Harlem had changed. He could feel it in the air as Finn drove him uptown. The rhythms were faster, the music was different. A new generation was rising, one that didn't know his name or his reputation. He was a ghost from another era. He spent the first few weeks re-establishing his presence, meeting with his old crew, taking the measure of the new landscape. The numbers racket was still there, but heroin was everywhere. The trickle he had allowed had become a flood in his absence, a tide of despair that was washing over his home. His pact with Corrigan had held the line, but one man couldn't hold back the ocean. He didn't seek Corrigan out. He wasn't sure what he would say. The debt was too large, too strange, to be acknowledged with a simple thank you. But Corrigan found him. A week after his return, Bumpy was having coffee at his usual table in the back of the Red Rooster. It was quiet, mid-afternoon. The door opened, and a man walked in. He was older, his hair almost completely gray, his face lined with the weariness of 1,000 bad nights. He wore a cheap suit, but he carried himself with an authority that was unmistakable. He was Captain Joe Corrigan now, commander of the 27th Precinct. He walked straight to Bumpy's table. Finn, sitting nearby, tensed and started to rise. Bumpy waved him down. Corrigan stood over the table. The two men looked at each other, the 14 years since that night in the warehouse collapsing into a single, silent moment. "Johnson," Corrigan said. His voice was gravelly now. "Captain," Bumpy replied, nodding toward the empty chair. "Have a seat." Corrigan sat. A waitress came over, her eyes wide. "Coffee?" Bumpy asked. Corrigan nodded. They sat in silence until the coffee came. Corrigan wrapped his hands around the warm mug. "Welcome home," Corrigan said finally. It sounded strange coming from him. "It's good to be home," Bumpy said. "I hear you've been busy." Corrigan took a sip of his coffee. "I did what I could. It's never enough." He looked out the window at the people passing on Lenox Avenue. "The poison is worse than ever. The Italians are fighting the Zulus. The Zulus are fighting the Dominicans. They're selling death on every corner. The kids, they don't stand a chance. I aim to change that," Bumpy said quietly. Corrigan looked back at him. "I know you do. That's why I'm here. I'm retiring next year. My pension is locked in. I don't have to answer to anyone anymore." He leaned forward, his voice dropping. "I have files. Names, dates, shipment routes. Everything the department has been burying for years on the uptown heroin trade. Information I could never use officially. Information that would get a cop killed." He slid a plain manila envelope across the table. It was thick. "What is this?" Bumpy asked. "A retirement gift," Corrigan said. "You said it yourself, all those years ago. We have a common enemy. I fought my war from the inside. It's time to see what you can do from the outside." He stood up. "I never forgot that you had a choice that night. You could have put a bullet in my head. Everyone in that room wanted you to. But you didn't." Bumpy looked down at the envelope, then back up at the man who was, by every definition, his sworn enemy. "Why?" Bumpy asked. "Why do all this? For 14 years, you upheld your end. You owe me nothing." Corrigan paused at the edge of the table. A faint, sad smile touched his lips. "It was never about you, Johnson. It was never about me." He looked out the window again, his gaze falling on a group of children laughing as they ran past. "It was about them. It was always about them." He turned and walked out of the restaurant. leaving the envelope on the table. He didn't look back. Bumpy sat there for a long time, his hand resting on the envelope. It felt impossibly heavy. It was the culmination of a single act of mercy, a final, shocking dividend from a debt he never intended to collect. He had spared one man's life, and that man had spent the next 14 years trying to save a neighborhood. He had shielded Harlem. Finn came over to the table. "Boss, what is it?" Bumpy opened the envelope. It was filled with pages of names, connections, photographs. A complete blueprint of the heroin empire that was strangling his home. It was a weapon, a declaration of war. He looked up at Finn, and his eyes, for the first time since he'd walked out of prison, were burning with the old fire. The king had returned, and the shield had just handed him a sword. "Finn," Bumpy Johnson said, his voice a low, dangerous command. "Get the boys together. We're going to work."